It's a typical scene in any middle or high school anywhere in the country. Kids together, talking, laughing, hanging out. Situation normal, right? Are you sure? Sexual harassment can be easy to miss in the day-to-day routine. What appears commonplace on the surface may mask something more serious. With the Supreme Court's recent decision to expand Title IX legislation against sexual discrimination, schools are now legally and financially liable for failing to identify and take action against sexual harassment. And as a school employee, you now share responsibility for making sure student access to education is not affected by sexual harassment. But too often it does occur because employees and students don't really understand what it is or how to stop it.
Unfortunately, in about 80% of the cases, the person who does the sexual harassment is just having fun, and they don't even realize that they're offending someone. The people who tell the off-color jokes, the people who are touching people, calling them honey, and they don't realize that they are actually offending someone else. The person who laughs at another student because of the way they walk or the way they talk, that could very easily be sexual harassment, and the harasser doesn't even know he's doing it or she's doing it.
To eliminate sexual harassment, you have to first recognize it and second, take action. But it's not quite that simple. Unfortunately, there's a lot of confusion about sexual harassment, and there are few absolutes, no hard and fast rules to guide you. So how do you identify sexual harassment and protect your school against liability?
Sexual harassment is unwanted or unwelcome sexual behavior. The important point here is that it's unwanted or unwelcome. Sexual harassment can occur from female to female, female to male, male to female, and male to male.
Common examples include sexual advances, pressure for sexual favors, or touching of a sexual nature, displaying or distributing sexually explicit graffiti, drawings, pictures, or written materials, sexual gestures, sexual or dirty jokes, touching oneself sexually, or talking about one's sexual activity in front of others, and spreading rumors about or rating other sexual activity or performance. Of course, all physical contact isn't sexual in nature. How many times have you seen a coach interacting with or helping an athlete? A teacher physically consoling a youngster who's upset? Or a student or teacher demonstrating a sports or dance move that entails touching another? Then what is sexual harassment? There are two types. Quid pro quo, literally this for that, means a school employee uses his or her position of authority to force unwelcome sexual conduct on a student. A teacher may imply that a youngster's grade is at stake, or a school staffer may indicate the teenager's participation in a school activity will be affected. Quid pro quo is one of the few absolutes of sexual harassment. It is always illegal, period.
Hey, is everything okay in here?
Grades. We're just talking about grades, right?
I have to go.
The other type of sexual harassment is hostile environment. Legally, it's defined as a situation so severe, persistent, or pervasive that it adversely affects a student's physical or emotional well-being, academic performance, or ability to benefit from educational programs and activities. There's a key distinction in that legalese.
I believe hostile environment harassment usually requires a series of occurrences. It's possible for it to be one single occurrence, such as groping an individual, but I think calling someone honey and darling over and over again and so forth, and saying you look great and with some type of sexual connotation, that could be a hostile environment.
Hostile environment harassment can occur anywhere, but it is most likely in less structured settings, such as hallways, cafeterias, locker rooms, or playgrounds. But it's not confined to school grounds. It can happen on a school bus, at a sports event, or during any other school-related activity. It can be fostered by practically anyone: school staff, non-employees on school property or at school events, even other students. Which brings up another factor, the psychology of adolescence. When facing possible sexual harassment in a middle or high school setting, the student's age and maturity are relevant. Adolescence is a tough time for kids. They're still trying to figure out who they are and where they belong in the world. Their concept of relationships, what comprises appropriate social and sexual behavior, is still developing. Plus, each child develops at a different rate.
And this is one I think young people really need to pay attention to. Differences in verbal maturity, language maturity, and difference in language ability. A person who's very good with language and words is teasing somebody who's not so good. The person who's doing the teasing thinks that it's funny, thinks it's inclusive, a friendly gesture. The person who is lower and hasn't developed as much skills of language doesn't understand the humor or the irony, the joke, and takes it offensively.
In short, conduct that's perfectly acceptable to one teenager might send another who's younger or less mature into a tailspin. A key thing to remember is that harassment is about power and perception. Obviously, as a school employee, students recognize your authority, but they may perceive their contemporaries to have power over them too. And this is where the psychology of adolescence comes in, because peer pressure is a powerful force in teenagers' lives.
It's hard for kids to say no to other kids. If it's hard for them to say no to an adult, it's going to be particularly hard when they want to fit in with their peers, they want to be friends with everybody, so they may not say no when something is really bothering them.
But there are always those kids who are on the fringes or left out altogether. You know the ones. They seem especially vulnerable. Sometimes their exclusion takes a nasty turn.
Vulnerability itself is a vulnerability. The kids will pick on somebody who feels poorly about themselves and doesn't have the psychological wherewithal to defend themselves.
That's painful enough, but if sexual overtones are part of it, it can also be hostile environment sexual harassment, requiring you to act. And kids who aren't specifically targeted may also become victims of hostile environment. When an uninvolved teen finds others' conduct, sexual jokes for instance, unwelcome and objectionable, it's third-party harassment. So how do you differentiate between normal teenage interaction and sexual harassment? First, consider your own opinions, because if you're like most people, you probably define sexual harassment in fairly narrow terms. A man victimizing a woman.
Usually it's a man harassing a woman sexually, I think, but it could be a woman harassing another woman, such as saying over and over to a particular younger lady, you've never had sexual intercourse, have you? Over and over again. That's sexual harassment. Or a man to a man, that's possible. Then there's the poor person who's sitting over here to the left while the people on the right are telling these ugly jokes, and they're subjected to something they don't want to be subjected to. The third-party harassment, I call that.
In short, whenever two or more people come together, the potential for sexual harassment exists. So when does social interaction cross the line? Certain conditions must exist for sexual harassment to occur. First of all, one person's sexual conduct, whether speech or behavior, must be unwelcome by another. If an individual does not invite or welcome the conduct, or regards it as offensive or undesirable, it may be sexual harassment. And while kids should be encouraged to speak up when they're subjected to offensive behavior, failure to immediately object does not constitute tacit welcome.
So a lot of the time students don't speak up, not because they're not upset or not because they're not anxious, but because they just don't know how to talk to somebody that they go to school with every day, or that they like in other situations, or that they play on a team with.
And opinions about sexual harassment vary widely between the sexes. Women tend to find a wider range of behavior unacceptable than men do.
One person says I was joking, the other person says that it was harassment.
So it's how the person feels about the behavior, not the intent of the person who actually engages in the behavior.
Again, perception is the determining factor. In fact, intent carries less weight than perception in questions of sexual harassment. But the law also recognizes that some claims of sexual harassment may be unreasonable. For that reason, courts establish standards to judge allegations of sexual harassment.
It used to be, would a reasonable person be offended by the activity? Then they switched it over to, would a reasonable woman be offended, because they realized that there was a difference between a woman and a man, because the men usually harassed the women instead of a woman harassing a man. Now they've switched back, much to the consternation of the women's groups, to the reasonable person standard. Now what is that? That's, would the average person, for example, be offended by a certain activity? That's what a reasonable person is.
In either case, though, the best advice is, if there is any question about another's reaction to your conduct, don't do it. If response to particular types of behavior are negative, stop it immediately, because failure to cease objectionable behavior is sexual harassment.
Can you imagine any circumstances in which someone might find this frightening or offensive? If you can, then don't do it.
Understanding and identifying sexual harassment is only the first step in avoiding legal and financial liability for your school. The next is prompt, appropriate, effective action, and that's where your school's Title IX mandate comes in.
The sexual harassment requirements are that there be clear policies, there be procedures for filing complaints, there be steps that the school has to go through in response to those complaints, and that a decision be made about whether or not the complaint that was made was indeed a case of sexual harassment. And if it's a case of sexual harassment, there has to be continued documentation that that sexual harassment has been stopped.
The law also requires that at least one person with training and expertise in sexual harassment be designated to ensure the school's compliance with Title IX. Part of the Title IX coordinator's responsibilities should include careful and complete documentation of the school's anti-harassment program. All possible or reported instances of sexual harassment, whether or not they resulted in formal complaints, should be kept on file. It's a good idea to also keep records of training sessions, surveys, and other actions that support the school's anti-harassment efforts. The Title IX coordinator's name, address, and phone number should be posted and publicized on a regular basis, too. From the liability standpoint, having a person and process in place to handle sexual harassment is effective. It's a strong message for staff, students, and parents alike that your school is serious about curbing sexual harassment. On the other hand, failure to have them can, in and of itself, be enough for liability, even if school officials were unaware of any instances of sexual harassment.
Do you have a plan? I mean, sexual harassment is out there, so you have to have a plan for reporting the sexual harassment, number one. You have to have a plan for doing something about the sexual harassment, number two. And number three, to stop the sexual harassment. And if you don't do that, I can tell you right now, the boss, whoever owns the firm or the school district, they're going to be liable for this sexual harassment. You've got to have a plan. And it'll cost you $25,000 at least just to defend it. There is liability if you don't have a plan.
Staff training should be integral to your school's program against sexual harassment, because ignorance does not excuse inaction, nor does it lessen legal culpability. Regular training also heightens sexual harassment awareness. There are often indications that a student may be a victim. Recognizing them can often help you pick up on sexual abuse before any harm is done. They include a youngster who's suddenly inattentive or has trouble learning, truancy, either skipping class or missing school altogether, or a student who seems withdrawn or isolated.
Well, usually if you can see the signs, then you may be able to prevent difficulties later on. A lot of times what you'll see is a change in the way the child usually behaves, a dramatic change. They may become more inattentive, they may have trouble learning, they may become more withdrawn, or they may even become more irritable.
Staff training should also outline ways each employee should respond. Some schools empower all employees to intervene immediately, while others direct staff to report sexual harassment to designated experts for action. There should also be some method of getting new staff members up to speed on the school's harassment policies and procedures. And making students aware is equally important. Teens are sometimes guilty just because they don't understand what sexual harassment is. Kids should understand that their thoughts and feelings might be telling them something, that maybe they're victims of sexual harassment. Confusion, guilt, anger, helplessness, feeling scared or isolated can all be symptoms. So can thinking, why me? Or, I can't believe this is happening to me.
The worst thing is a sense of powerlessness that a youngster would feel, that they don't have control over their lives, that things happen to them and there's nothing that they can do about it. Then there's also the loss of self-esteem, there's identity confusion, they aren't sure who they are, how they're supposed to act, there's depression and there's anxiety.
Regular, age-appropriate awareness training helps young people come to terms with their feelings, better understand sexual harassment, and learn how to respond to it. It's also helpful to periodically survey students to find out whether they believe sexual harassment is occurring. Offering sexual harassment awareness training for parents is a good idea too, because they can often detect signs of it in their children. Besides, it reinforces for them the school's serious attitude towards sexual harassment. If a student, parent, or employee believes sexual harassment is occurring, it should be promptly reported to a school official. It's important for sexual harassment procedures to be accessible to students, parents, even staff who feel they're victims.
One of the first steps is to listen to the student, take down what the student has said, read that back to the student to try to make sure that you understand clearly what the student has told you. Then tell the student about the grievance procedures or the steps that can be taken and what's going to happen.
Students in particular need to feel they'll be taken seriously and protected from any form of retaliation. Once a report of sexual harassment is made, the school's prompt response is critical. Whether or not a formal complaint is lodged, a rigorous investigation should be launched immediately.
There needs to be a clear understanding with the student and very often with the parents about what has happened, what the reports have been, and what the school district plans to do about it.
While not required by law, many school districts encourage interim steps, such as reporting back to the complainant during investigations. It's an assurance the charge is being taken seriously. It's also beneficial, where possible, to separate the alleged harasser and victim, transferring one to a different class, for instance. Include parents in discussion and take notes. An impartial investigator should be assigned to conduct in-depth interviews and gather as much evidence as possible.
I would ask them what happened. I would ask them what they did. I would ask them what the perpetrators did, to make sure that the young person understood that I was taking them seriously.
The investigator should also take great care never to imply that the youngster invited the sexual harassment. If the alleged harassment involves potentially criminal conduct, schools may report it to law enforcement officials as well. When investigating possible sexual harassment, several factors should be considered. The nature of the conduct, what it was, where, how often, and how long it occurred. The relative ages and sex of the complainant and the accused. The number of harassers. If there were any other incidents involving the same or different youngsters that might indicate a pattern. Whether the accused harasser was in a position of real or perceived power over the complainant. And of course, whether the conduct adversely affected the youngster's education or educational environment. Throughout the investigation, the school is responsible for ensuring there is no harm, retaliation, or intimidation against the complainant. Now, what happens if a student requests confidentiality?
In an ideal world, you would have confidentiality, and a student wouldn't have to be bothered with the rest of the world knowing that they had reported a certain activity. But A person who is accused in the American way has a right to be confronted with their accuser. And so it's not always possible to give confidentiality, and particularly if there are a lot of people involved. I mean, the accused also has rights.
But confidentiality does not preclude action. Reallocation of adult supervision to prevent harassment can result in observations that will confirm reports. There's often more than one victim. If nothing else, seminars on sexual harassment, accompanied by a strong reminder that it will not be tolerated, may be enough to curb the problem. And don't forget that school action against sexual harassment is not contingent on a complaint. Observation of possible incidents by a staff member or student warrants action.
It's important to understand that an intervention is appropriate even if you're not sure whether the behavior would technically qualify as sexual harassment. If it's objectionable behavior, even if kids feel comfortable with it, it's not appropriate in schools.
When sexual harassment is judged to have occurred, the victim should be assured that corrective action will be promptly taken. The school's options include the full range of disciplinary actions, and appropriate punishment can discourage further incidents. If possible, the victim and harasser should be permanently separated. Counseling can help the victim overcome any lasting effects, and can also help the harasser understand how hurtful the experience can be.
The best thing to do is to talk to other people. As soon as they can let other people know what's happened and they begin getting feedback from other people that what's happened to them is not right, and that how they feel about themselves and their sense of powerlessness doesn't have to be that way. Getting into therapy is an excellent way to rethink their conceptions about themselves and to get that sense of power again in their lives.
Students deserve a healthy educational environment free from sexual harassment, and you can help make sure they have it. If you know what to look for, if you help take advantage of your school's Title IX policies and procedures, you can act to confront sexual harassment before it takes root. And that's the best way to help your school avoid financial and legal liability. Be vigilant and do your part to tackle school sexual harassment.